Hello and welcome to Ego Show. This is the 22nd episode now. My name is Henry. I'm a PhD student studying ecology, and the show is about the latest research and news in ecology and eco-related things. I also usually start each episode with either a plant, animal, or other thing of the week. And this week is no different. So let's jump into this week. Our animal of the week this week is the ladybug or the ladybird. And there's a old classic rhyme that goes with that, which is ladybird, ladybird, fly away home. Your house is on fire and your children are gone. All except one. Her name is Anne, and she hid under the baking pan. And at the end of this Animal of the Week segment, you'll find out what that poem was all about, what it was referencing. Okay, so the ladybug, or the ladybird in the UK, got the name because ladybird comes from Our Lady's Birds, and that's because Mary wore a red cloak in early art, and there are also 7 spots on the species that was common there in the UK, and this was also common in Europe, which was, so these 7 spots on the back of the butterfly were like Mary's 7 joys and 7 sorrows, which I don't know too much about. But basically, the 7 joys and 7 sorrows were 7. Well, I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, so that's sort of what was based off of. And I have a photo here, which I imagine I will put on the YouTube, which has got a photo of Mary with some spots on and a red cloak. Okay, and here is a photo of a ladybug. I'm from the US and they call it a ladybug in the US, so that's what I'm used to. So I'm going to keep doing it. And ladybugs are actually a widespread family. So I'll have a photo up here which will show the hierarchy of life, which we refer to when we're talking about different animals. So we have, starting at the top, we have life, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And so Coccynelidae, which is what ladybugs are, is a family. So there's a whole bunch of ladybugs. And yeah, so it's not a usual family. This is the family as in taxonomy. And the species, which is sort of the finest point, or the smallest, or the reference point when you're pointing to, that's a species. Like humans are a species. There are 6,000 of those of ladybug. Okay, but I would call it a ladybug, but you shouldn't really call it a bug because it's not a true bug. And what is a true bug, you might ask? Well, we'll have a photo here which shows some close-up images of bugs. And true bugs have mouth parts that they use to suck, which is a rigid straw. So we'll have some photos here showing that this is what they're using. And it's not like not like a fly's proboscis, where you can we think of it unfurling. It's not like that. So bugs are things that have that solid thing. And a question you may be thinking about with ladybugs is why do they have this red color? And one of the reasons is that it warns predators that they don't taste very good. So ladybugs do actually have toxins, so it's a true warning. They have a pretty high concentration of toxins in them. There are some other ideas, though, that this color can help to displace heat, it can help to camouflage, or it can help attract mates. So it's got a lot of uses. This bit that has the color on it is actually a forewing, so you don't use it to fly, but it covers up the real wings that they use to fly. And your vocab word for the week is elytron, and that's what those are called. So you can impress your friends with. Next time you see a ladybug, you can say, "Wow, what beautiful elytrons they have," and your friends will be amazed and so proud and just think you're the coolest. Ladybugs are pretty hardcore. They are mostly carnivorous, although they do eat, some species eat plants and things like that. And you'll know this already because oftentimes ladybugs are used to control things like aphids. So they will eat aphids and scale. Scale is another type of pest. So they love eating those. And they're also promiscuous breeders. So they are going at it. And a cool thing about their sort of breeding pattern is that they will lay their eggs near prey, which is just psycho. So as soon as those little eggs start to hatch, they have plenty to eat. These are good flyers. They can travel up to 120 kilometers, and they can travel at a speed of 30 kilometers per hour. And they've been recorded as getting up to 1,100 meters in altitude flying, which is the same as 3,600 feet. And that's from a paper that I will put up a photo of, titled Characteristics and Drivers of High Altitude Ladybird Flight, Insights from Vertical Looking Entomological Radar, by Daniel Jeffries et al. And so what is the role of these in the ecosystem? Well, we've talked about already that they are predators, but they're also prey and they're also hosts. So they're very important in the ecosystem. We talked about them eating aphids and scale, but they will also sometimes cannibalize other ladybugs. They're preyed on by birds, ants, and spiders. Ants sometimes will even dispose of those eggs we mentioned that are laid near aphids. So ants will get rid of them. And they have this cool defense mechanism, which is to reflex bleed, which is kind of an amazing reflex. So we'll have a photo here of this reflex bleeding, which is when they excrete some fluid so the predator can taste it, and it tastes nasty, it tastes bitter. So it's to give what's going to be eating them a hint that they are no good to eat, which they aren't because they are poisonous. And they're doing all this, they're being eaten, they're eating, and they're hosts. That means that parasites and fungi will infect them. They're on every continent but Antarctica. They can live in high mountains, desert, and cold areas. And I have this long section I've written here, which is not bullet pointed, so I'm going to have to read from it directly. And I was saying this section, they have been exported around the world to help control pests. Yeah, so we mentioned this earlier. You can oftentimes buy ladybugs and put them on your houseplants. When you have scale, like I do on my monstera, or if you have aphids. And it was introduced particularly well one time in 1887. A species called Novius cardinalis was taken from Australia and taken to California to protect trees from scale, orange trees, I believe, and it worked really well. Since then, there's been mixed results with using other species of ladybug to help control pests. The issue with moving them around the world is that they're so well adapted to different areas that sometimes they'll outcompete other ladybugs. So we talked about that there's 6,000 species of ladybug, and in some cases they may outcompete ones that are specialized to particular areas by just brute force eating them, things like that. And a random fact about ladybugs is that they can taint wine, and apparently as few as 1.3 to 1.5 per 1 kilogram of grapes can impact quality. That's individuals. So pretty much 1 to 2 ladybugs in a kilogram of grapes can impact the quality. So they are sometimes causing problems. The main issue being that sort of outcompeting and loss of other species. Otherwise, pretty cool. You gotta love ladybugs. And back to the nursery rhyme. There's lots of stories for what it may have come from, the origins of it, but the one that I liked the most was that the rhyme came from farmers. And farmers liked ladybugs because they would eat pests. So it is said that they would say this rhyme before they set fire to stubble fields. So stubble fields after you've harvested your crop, your wheat and whatnot. You've got all the stubble left out in the field, and it said that they would say this nursery rhyme as a tribute to the ladybugs, kind of as a little warning to them. Go get your babies before they set the stubble fields on fire to burn them off. Okay, I think that's all we have for this. That's all we have for ladybugs. I have no idea how long I'm taking today, which I should. I don't know what time I started, but now I know what time it is. Anywho, okay, we're on to research. I know there's a lot in this one, so we're going to keep it moving and grooving. Research. Today we're talking about sharks, in particular, hammerhead sharks, which are very cool. They look awesome. It looks super bulky, that hammer, doesn't it? Anywho, so this journal article is about shark migration, and particularly around Mexico. So we'll have a photo here of the area in particular that they were studying, which is in Baja, Mexico, which is below California. And the habitat use of hammerhead sharks is not very well known in this area of the Pacific around Mexico. And it's important to understand this because they are harvested. So for sure, people are collecting them. So you got to understand how they're using the habitat, get a better understanding of these populations in order to manage them well. And to manage them well, we need to know their movements and where they're hanging out. Especially because since they're marine animals, it's more complex than animals on land, because they have areas where there'll be nursery, there'll be baby shark, and then they have places where there'll be daddy mommy shark, and maybe places where there'd be grandma shark as well. But they need to migrate between these nursery areas and deep water areas. But how are you supposed to understand this? So the way that they are proposing and did track shark movements and how long they're staying in different habitats is by using mercury. Not Freddie Mercury, but mercury like the element, or like what would be in your thermometer. And this is the thing that we're all told to worry about, is to not eat too much tuna and things like that, because they have mercury in them. And so marine animals, particularly predators who are at the top of the food chain, accumulate a lot of mercury inside their bodies and in their different tissues, because they're eating things and mercury has been moving up the food chain. And so they are eating things with the highest concentration of it, and they're getting it in them. But the key thing with mercury is that it is sensitive to light exposure. And you can use that to tell where a shark has been eating. So in shallow water, mercury gets photodegraded, so it's getting degraded by sunlight. And in deeper water, that mercury is not getting degraded. So the prey that these hammerhead sharks are eating in their nursery habitats are coastal areas. And so that mercury is being highly degraded by light. But the mercury that is being eaten by mature adults is out at sea, and that's in species that are deeper out in the water. So I've got an image here that just shows what I explained. We've got the young in shallow water eating things that have mercury, which has been degraded by light exposure. And then we have a transitional zone, and then we have our animals farther in the deep that have mercury still, but it's less degraded by light, but it's still being eaten by these mature sharks. And so they are sampling, what the researchers did is sample the mercury that was in different individuals. And this was done by getting samples from over 100 hammerhead sharks, which is pretty remarkable, but they noted that they didn't need any ethical approval because they went along basically with fishing ships and just with fishermen. So the fishermen went and they caught the fish that they're going to catch, and then they just took a little sample of the shark flesh to test for mercury. So that's a good workaround. If you need animal ethics approval, just work with people who are going to be killing the thing already. And so they did find that shark body length, which they use to estimate the age of the shark, the length of the shark correlated with these mercury concentration trends. So the longer the shark body got, the more they had of this non-photodegraded mercury. And the shorter they were, the more the mercury was degraded. because it was in shallow areas. And they could use that to estimate around when the young moved out to sea. And they found that hammerhead sharks tend to spend 2 years before they fully migrate to start to be hang out in deeper waters more. So the importance of this is they said that it's important to protect the coasts then, because a lot of fishing happens near the coastlines. It's better there needs to be a better understanding of these habitats for sharks around the coast, because they're spending a lot of time here, and these are young that you want to make sure can develop to maturity so they can then lay more sharks, make more baby sharks. So I wonder if fisher people might be a little bummed seeing this, because it sort of advocates for more marine protected areas, but in the long run, you got to protect the baby sharks if you want to have the bigger sharks to eat. And that's the research. So I think that may have been one of the clearer research articles I've done on this so far. So the main things to learn about that is that you can use mercury to track the ages and habitat use of sharks. I thought that was really cool from this. So big takeaways is that basically. Okay, let's hop over to the news now. News time. I do this so that when I'm editing, I know where to put the markers. Okay, our first news thing is about protests. So there have been a lot of protests recently, but this past week, 1,500 people were arrested in the Netherlands, including the actor who plays Melisandre in Game of Thrones. So maybe she's not so bad after all. And activists were out on the highway in the Netherlands protesting they're demanding an end to fossil fuel subsidies. Police fired water cannons, but they had raincoats and swimsuits, which is pretty great. Most of those were released, but there are 40 who will be prosecuted. So this was making me think we would get to expand on protests a little bit, because it's always good to talk about that. There are lots of protests going on around the world. There were student protests in New Zealand, and there were a lot of Extinction Rebellion protests going on in the UK. And it brings up this question of, do protests work? And that's sort of you can kind of feel that in the air sometimes. You can feel it particularly in the media. Oftentimes it's not usually taken very seriously. And sometimes people are drawn into the people who are protesting, are sort of painted as, being on the outskirts or something. But so do they work? And there's this book called Why Civil Resistance Work. It's by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen. And they collected and analyzed data on over 300 nonviolent and violent major political protests. Because sometimes people can get into this headspace of, nonviolent protests, they aren't going to do anything. You gotta get violent, basically. People can sort of start to have that tone. But they found that in their study of protest movements, nonviolent ones were more successful than violent ones and lasted longer. Or like the change stuck around for longer. So there's a 53% success rate for nonviolent protest campaigns and 25% success for armed protest campaigns. And what's more, the armed campaigns tended to take longer to succeed as well. So you're getting much less bang for your buck with an armed protest because it takes longer and it's not really as sturdy of a change, they found in their research in this book. And the important thing is to think of these protests not as necessarily just one-off events that are going to change everything, but as campaigns, just like the win the battle, end the war, or something like that. Even though we're not doing, we don't want to do violent protests, but there's that good phrase having to do with war. So thinking about that's sort of what they're emphasizing, is that thinking about these things, these nonviolent campaigns, as campaigns, not just as one-off protests. And this nonviolent resistance that makes up a campaign includes protests. It includes not buying particular products. Like there were big boycotts back in the 80s in California. Well, I'm not sure the exact time period, but there were big protest movements in California around not buying grapes and not buying diamonds, I think, from South Africa at other times. So nonviolence includes a whole host of things, not just protests. And in general, what nonviolence resistance is not going with the status quo that you are disagreeing with. From this book, they state that no regime stayed in power when 3.5% of the population had participated in active protests. That doesn't mean that when you get to that percent, that's an average that they found. That's not some magical number, but it's an average, which is an interesting thing to think about. So that is talking about active protests and saying on average, when you have 3.5% of the population in active protest, you tend to get change happening. And as these protests grow, they reach more people, which grows and gets people more involved and more connected. And the idea of thinking about it as a campaign is that it takes time for these changes to come, because you have the people who are initially on board with an idea or leading the way, and then you have people who will get on board with the idea, and then you have people who would take a little longer to get on board. And so you got to get the momentum to get to the point where you're convincing the people who are resistant to getting on board. But I think in some ways it's, as much as it is appealing to have quick change seems like it leads to quick change. So by really putting in the time, it allows you to feel out the problem as well and to get to solutions and bring people on board. So do protests work? Yeah, they do work. But also it's important to think of them, at least as they say in this book, to think of them as part of campaigns. And if protests aren't your thing, that's okay. There are other ways to work on issues that you care about. But there is that 3.5% number about being engaged in active protest. I'm not quite sure if that means on the street protest or engaging in this sort of nonviolent resistance. I think it is actually. I think they mean on the street protest. So get out there for a protest if you believe in it, It shows people that, and it can start a conversation. You don't have to start a conversation, but people might ask you questions about it. It can be an opportunity to learn and things like that. Okay. So we have that. I want to change the order of things around because we have some other news, but I thought that was an interesting thing to explore. Our next article, there was a big deep sea mining survey done. There is a push to do a lot more deep sea mining, especially for these things called, I think they're calling them nodules, but it's at the surface level oftentimes of the ocean floor, and they have cobalt and nickel in them. They can be used for electric vehicles and things like that. And there was a big stock take done of an area that wants to be that is of interest to be mined, which is called the Clarion Clipperton Zone, which I have a photo of here circled, which is in the Pacific Ocean. So they did a big survey of the creatures there, with many unknown to science. There were 5,000 found down there, 5,000 different creatures found, and only 400 of those were already known to science. So the first photo that I have here is of this ping pong sponge, which looks pretty adorable. We also have a photo of a sea star, which is adhering to one of these metallic nodules that we're talking about, that they sort of want to scrape off the bottom of the seafloor. And this next photo we have is they're calling it a gummy squirrel. It'd be cool if they put some little size markers on these so you can get an idea of it. But you can see in the background that it does look like there's a lot of these little nodules around. And so that's an important thing to consider, that when we are talking about and we're wanting to get these environmental changes done, a lot of times the solution is not super clean and tidy. So this area in particular, there's obviously a huge amount of biodiversity there, and probably we're not too sure of what sort of ocean ecosystem role this place and these species have, but they're doing their thing, and you don't want to mess with things that are living in general. It's a thing to consider. And I think this will be our good news to wrap up the week this week, is that dolphins are back in the Bronx River. And these were bottlenose dolphins. A photo of bottlenose dolphins here. Now the Bronx River has been an essential river for food and transportation for First Nations before settlers got there. And we see here, I can't point to the photo for you, but I'll put up a big map here. And this shows Manhattan, which is the big dangly bit, and the Bronx is just above Manhattan. And this freshwater river goes through there. It's been historically, so it was a central river for food and transport because it was the one main freshwater river in that New York area. The other big rivers that you think of there are salty river, so it would have been a water source even for First Nations people, and then later for settlers. Following industrialization and urbanization, this got very polluted, but the Bronx River Alliance has worked with lots of other organizations to clean it up, get removal of toxic wastes and pollutants done. Also, rainwater quality has improved in the area from things like rain gardens and permeable pavement. There's also been tree planting campaigns, vegetation planting, and removing obstructions like dams. So there'll be lots of obstructions in the river that have been put in place that would discourage the dolphins from coming into that space, but it was not clear what was leading to dolphins come back into that space in particular, but people seem to think it was them going after some fish. So probably good to hold off on saying it's a big success until it's a more consistent finding. They might just be hanging out in the shallows, rolling around, playing around. But it would seem to be a good sign for the Bronx River. And that can be a thing to think about in your community. Are there any rivers? Are there any pieces of nature that have either been covered up or, because that happens a lot. Oftentimes creeks or streams are paved over, covered up, and there's a movement to reopen those. There was a good reason back in the day to cover up these creeks, because oftentimes they would be pretty much just open sewage lines. And so by covering them up, you prevent there being as much disease getting out and about, but we've got much better sewage systems that are separate from these creeks and things now. So we can work to open up streams and rehabilitate places. I'm sure there's some psychology out there that if you are working on restoration or regeneration projects, it just makes you feel better about life, better about the world. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. There can be a lot of bad news going around. It's important but bad news sells, so gotta keep that in mind. And that's about it for this week. So I hope you all are having a good week. I hope you've had a good week / good weekend, and we'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.